The boy's scream cut through the afternoon heat like a blade. "Your mother's alive! I saw her at the dump!" His voice cracked, but his eyes burned with truth. The millionaire froze mid-step, his expensive shoes inches from the filthy curb, the words echoing louder than any siren. The woman in red went pale because sometimes the dirtiest places hide the cleanest hearts. "Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story?" The night unfolded beneath the soft glow of chandeliers that hung like frozen raindrops above the ballroom. The sound of jazz brushed the air, smooth and careful, like an old record spinning in the corner of a summer porch. Nathaniel Callahan stood near the grand piano, hands tucked neatly behind his back, his expression composed for the photographers that drifted around him like moths chasing light. He was the face of the Callahan Foundation 38, successful, sharply dressed, admired. Yet behind every polite smile was a silence that followed him like a shadow. When he spoke from the stage, thanking donors for their faith and compassion, the crowd clapped, and yet not a single note of warmth reached his voice. It was measured, perfect, rehearsed. From across the room, Victoria Haynes watched him with the satisfied smile of someone who had built the evening herself. Her sequined gown shimmered in the golden light as she leaned toward a senator's wife, whispering something that made the woman laugh too loudly. Everything about Victoria was control. Her gestures, her tone, even the way she looped her arm through Nate's when they greeted the mayor. Between speeches and handshakes, the waiter poured another round of champagne. Nate raised his glass, his eyes catching his reflection in the mirrored wall. He didn't look proud. He looked tired. Outside the ballroom's tall windows, the lights of Savannah twinkled across the river, quiet and indifferent. He longed to step out there, to breathe something real. When the final toast ended and the applause faded, he slipped away through the terrace doors. The cool autumn air touched his face, carrying the scent of magnolia and river salt. Down below, Forsyth Park stretched out in calm darkness, its oaks draped with Spanish moss that swayed like memories. He rested both hands on the railing and whispered to the night, "Mom, I did what you wanted helping others. So why does it feel so empty?" The city answered with distant laughter and the faint toll of a church bell. He thought of her again, Margaret Callahan, gone for 15 years. Her picture still framed on his piano, the only photo not replaced by awards. He had tried to bury the ache in success, to drown it in speeches and charity dinners. But guilt always found its way back. Inside, the band switched from jazz to swing, and Victoria's voice cut through the noise, calling for him. "Nathaniel, darling, come say goodbye to the governor." Her laughter followed like perfume. He turned, forcing a smile, stepping back into the golden light. People spoke of his kindness, his influence, his heart for the community, yet none of them knew how hollow it all felt. A small boy, working as a busboy, tripped near the buffet line, spilling a tray of glasses. Victoria flinched in irritation, but Nate crouched to help the boy gather the shards. "Easy," he said softly. "Don't cut yourself." The boy muttered a shy, "Thank you, sir." Nate smiled faintly, almost forgetting the cameras until Victoria tugged his arm. "You don't need to do that, sweetheart. The staff will handle it." He straightened up, brushing his hands, the warmth from that simple act lingering longer than the applause from earlier. For a fleeting second, something human broke through the mask, a small reminder of who he once was. And then, the band stopped mid-song. A loud commotion interrupted the calm. The ballroom doors slammed open with a noise that made every head turn. The doorman stumbled forward, trying to block the entrance. But a small barefoot boy darted past him, his breath sharp, his eyes wide with fear and urgency. The music froze, forks clinked against plates, the laughter of Savannah's elite dying midair. The boy's clothes were torn, his feet dusty, his hair tangled. He looked no older than 10. For a moment, nobody moved. Victoria stepped back in disbelief, clutching her purse as if the child carried a disease. "Security!" she snapped, her voice slicing through the silence. But before the guards reached him, the boy's gaze found Nate. He pointed straight at him, his voice trembling, yet loud enough to echo through the crystal hall. "Mr. Callahan, your mother's alive. I saw her by the Bayview landfill." The words struck like thunder in a quiet church. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some laughed nervously, others whispered. A few phones rose discreetly to record the scandal. Nate froze, unable to breathe. He had not heard that word mother spoken with such conviction in years. Victoria was the first to recover. "Who let this child in here?" she demanded. "What nonsense is this?" The guards finally reached the boy, but he squirmed away, holding out something small in his hand. "She gave me this," he said desperately. "She said to find you." Nate blinked. The boy's palm opened to reveal a rosary, its silver chain dull with age, one bead missing near the cross. Nate's heart lurched. It was identical to the one his mother used to wear, the one buried with her. "Where did you get that?" His voice cracked as he stepped forward, ignoring Victoria's warning look. "I told you," the boy said, tears shining on his dirty cheeks. "She's alive. She lives near the dump, where the trucks go every night. She told me to tell you before they move her again." Gasps filled the room. The boy's words tangled with whispers. Some guests found it amusing, others scandalous. The mayor's wife muttered, "Good Lord," under her breath. But Nate didn't hear any of them. His eyes locked on the rosary, trembling in that small, filthy hand. Victoria moved quickly, whispering harshly, "He's just looking for money. Don't make a scene." She gestured for the guards to remove him. The boy tried to resist, his small voice breaking. "Please, I'm not lying." "Wait," Nate said quietly, raising a hand. The guards froze. The entire ballroom had fallen silent again. His voice was steady but soft, the kind that made people listen without knowing why. "What's your name, son?" "Elijah," the boy whispered. "But they call me Eli." Nate nodded slowly, his gaze gentle. "All right, Eli. Tell me again, where did you see her?" Eli looked around nervously, unsure if anyone believed him. "By the landfill, sir. Bayview, near the river. She hums when she works an old song about light and home." The world seemed to tilt. Nate remembered that melody, the one his mother used to play at night before tucking him into bed. He hadn't heard it since he was 13. It came back now in fragments, soft and haunting, wrapping around his heart like fog. Victoria's voice broke the moment. "Enough! This is absurd." She turned to the security guard. "Take him outside, and call the police if you must." Eli's eyes filled with tears as the guards led him toward the door. "I'm telling the truth," he shouted, twisting in their grip. "She said you'd understand if I showed you this." The rosary slipped from his hand and hit the marble floor with a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the silence. Nate bent down instinctively, picking it up. The metal was cold against his palm, heavier than it should have been. He turned it over once, twice his thumb tracing the missing bead, the one he had broken as a child. His heart stuttered. The boy was already being pushed outside when Nate looked up, his chest tight. "Wait," he said again. But the doors had swung shut. The music didn't start again. The crowd stood frozen, caught between curiosity and discomfort. Victoria placed a manicured hand on his arm. "Nathaniel, please, don't let this nonsense ruin our evening." Her tone was sweet, but her fingers gripped too tightly. He didn't answer. He just stared at the rosary resting in his hand, the same chain that had once slipped through his mother's fingers when she whispered her evening prayers. He felt something stir inside him, something old, something raw, something that refused to be silenced anymore. Outside the tall windows, the city of Savannah shimmered in golden light, unaware that a single truth had just cracked open a carefully built life. A barefoot boy bursts in, shouting, "Mr. Callahan! Your mother's alive. I saw her by the Bayview landfill." The morning sun crept gently over the rooftops of Savannah, brushing gold against the river and painting long shadows on the quiet streets. In the Callahan penthouse, overlooking the bay, Nate hadn't slept. The rosary lay on the nightstand beside a half-finished glass of bourbon. Every time he closed his eyes, the boy's voice returned, "Your mother's alive." He tried to reason it away. It was impossible. Margaret Callahan had died 15 years ago. He had the certificate, the obituary, the photographs of her funeral. Still, something inside him refused to quiet down. Maybe it was the missing bead, or the faint scent of lilac that lingered on the chain. Whatever it was, it didn't let him rest. By 7, he was already dressed, suit and tie perfect as ever. Yet his reflection in the mirror didn't look like the man who had commanded a ballroom. It looked like a son standing on the edge of disbelief. When Victoria called, her tone was brisk, almost rehearsed. "Darling, I hope you're not still thinking about last night. It was an unfortunate scene, but people forget these things quickly." "I'm not worried about people," Nate said, voice low. "I'm worried about truth." Victoria sighed. "Truth?" "Nathaniel, He was a street boy. Probably saw your name somewhere and made up a story for attention. Don't go chasing ghosts." She hung up before he could answer. Downstairs, his driver was waiting. But Nate waved him off. He needed air. The city smelled of roasted coffee and wet pavement as he walked without destination. His shoes echoed against cobblestone until the sound led him to the Magnolia Diner, a narrow place with steamed-up windows and a bell that jingled softly when the door opened. Inside, the clatter of dishes and the scent of fried eggs filled the room. An older woman behind the counter, her hair in a silver bun, smiled kindly. "Morning, sugar. Find yourself a booth. I'll be right with you." He nodded and slid into a seat near the window. The vinyl creaked beneath him, the kind of sound that belonged to 100 old stories. He ordered coffee and watched the people around him. Truckers, a nurse in scrubs, 2 retired men arguing about baseball. It felt real, grounded the opposite of the gala's glittering emptiness. When the door chimed again, he looked up. The boy from last night stood there, still barefoot, carrying a rag and a metal bucket. His eyes widened when he saw Nate. For a second, both froze. Then the boy looked down and mumbled, "I can clean tables for food, ma'am." The waitress, Miss Ruth, nodded gently. "You behave yourself, Eli. There's pancakes if you work quiet." Nate's pulse quickened. "Eli," he repeated softly. The boy turned, wary, as if expecting to be thrown out again. "I'm not mad," Nate said. "Sit down a minute." Eli hesitated, then approached the booth. He was smaller than Nate remembered, all elbows and worry, but his eyes were steady. "You kept it," he said, noticing the rosary in Nate's hand. "Yes," Nate replied. "And I'd like you to tell me everything, from the beginning." Eli sat on the edge of the booth, fingers tracing the rim of his bucket. "She lives near the landfill. Sometimes she walks by the river. People say she's crazy, but she talks about a boy named Nate. She hums when she works a song about light and home." Nate swallowed hard. "And she gave you this?" The boy nodded. "Said if I ever saw a man who looked like her son, I should show it to him." He paused. "She prays for you, sir, every night." Nate stared at the small cross in his hand until his vision blurred. Outside, a train whistle sounded far away, long and mournful. He felt as if it were calling him, pulling him towards something he wasn't ready to face. "Miss..." Ruth appeared with 2 plates of pancakes. "Figured the young man earned breakfast," she said warmly. Nate reached for his wallet, but she waved it off. "No charge. Lord knows we all need a little kindness." Eli grinned shyly, his first smile since entering. Nate couldn't help but return it. "Do you know where she stays exactly?" Nate asked once they'd eaten. Eli nodded, his tone turning serious. "Bayview, past the junkyard, near the old tracks. But it's dangerous there. People go missing." Nate looked out the window again, where sunlight touched the tops of the oaks. The same warmth that comforted the city only deepened his unease. Something inside whispered that this wasn't over, that every answer would demand a price. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of questions Nate couldn't silence. He walked Eli back to the alley behind the diner, where the boy had a small corner made from cardboard and a torn blanket. The sight of it, a place smaller than Nate's walk-in closet, tightened his chest. "Do you stay here alone?" he asked. Eli nodded, shrugging. "Sometimes Mr. Jenkins lets me sleep in his shed when it rains. He says my mom's up in heaven watching me, but maybe she's not. Maybe she's still down here, too." That simple sentence hit harder than any headline or report ever could. Nate knelt beside him. "Eli, if I wanted to find her, would you take me there?" The boy hesitated, chewing his lip. "You'd come? Even if it's dirty and smells bad?" "I'd come," Nate said, and meant it. They agreed to meet again that evening. Nate gave him some cash for food. Eli refused at first, then accepted only when Nate promised it wasn't charity, just payment for the map you'll draw me. When Nate walked away, the boy's voice called softly behind him. "She'll be happy you're coming, Mr. Callahan." Back at his office downtown, the day's meetings felt like another life entirely. Numbers, contracts, polished words, they all blurred into background noise. On his desk, the rosary glinted faintly in the afternoon light. He caught himself tracing the missing bead again and again, like a man searching for a heartbeat. Around 4, Victoria appeared at his door. "So, this is what obsession looks like," she said coolly. Her perfume filled the room before her words did. You canceled 2 meetings, ignored the board, and you're sitting here with a broken trinket? He looked up, calm but tired. It's my mother's trinket, she scoffed. You buried your mother, Nate. You built your entire foundation in her name. What else do you need? He set the rosary down carefully. Proof, he said. Victoria folded her arms. You're going to let a filthy kid drag you through the mud? I worked too hard to get you here. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then his voice dropped, almost a whisper. Maybe that's the problem, Victoria. You worked hard to get me here, but not to keep me human. She flinched, but only for a heartbeat. If you walk into that dump chasing ghosts, don't expect me to wait. She left without closing the door. The silence that followed felt heavier than her anger. Outside, clouds rolled in, turning the city a deeper gray. Nate leaned back in his chair, letting his thoughts drift to the last day he'd seen his mother alive. The hospital room, the machines, the cold fluorescent light. He'd been too afraid to stay until the end. He told himself it was better that way, that he wanted to remember her smiling, not fading. Now, the memory felt like cowardice. That evening, he returned to the diner. Miss Ruth handed him a folded piece of paper. Eli drew this for you. Said it's all he knows. The crude map showed the Bayview landfill, a broken bridge, and a spot marked with an X beside the river. He's got a good heart, that boy, she said softly. Reminds me of my grandson never gives up on lost causes. Nate thanked her and stepped outside. The air had cooled. Thunder rumbled far off toward the coast. He looked down at the map, then at the rosary again, still faintly smelling of lilac and metal. For the first time, he wasn't sure which frightened him more, that the boy was lying or that he was telling the truth. By nightfall, the penthouse felt like a cage. The city lights below blinked like restless eyes. Nate stood before the mirror, the rosary tangled between his fingers. He studied his reflection, impeccable suit, polished shoes, a man who had everything except peace. He turned the small cross over once more, his throat tightening. The silver was worn smooth, just where his mother's thumb would have rested during prayer. What if she never died? He whispered. The words hung in the air, fragile and alive. And somewhere deep inside, something answered not in words, but in the quiet certainty that tomorrow he would follow that map. Morning broke under a low sky the color of pewter. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the streets of Savannah slick and shining. Nate parked outside the hospital that had handled his mother's case street. Augustine Memorial, a place he hadn't visited since her funeral. The building loomed gray and quiet, its white columns streaked with age. He sat in the car for a long moment before stepping out, the rosary coiled tightly in his palm. There was a time when he thought this place had given him closure. Now it felt like a wound reopened. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. The reception desk was manned by a nurse with tired eyes and a soft voice. Good morning, sir. Can I help you? I'm looking for the records of Margaret Callahan, Nate said, keeping his tone polite. She was a patient here about 15 years ago. The nurse typed the name, frowning slightly. You'll need to speak with Dr. Carol Monroe. She's head of records now. A few minutes later, a tall woman in her 60s appeared, wearing a white coat and a guarded smile. Mr. Callahan, she greeted, offering a hand. I remember your mother. A wonderful piano teacher, wasn't she? Nate's pulse quickened. You knew her? Only briefly. I wasn't her attending physician, but I handled administrative files back then. What can I do for you? I'd like to review her medical documents, he said carefully. All of them, including the death certificate. Dr. Monroe hesitated. That's unusual after all this time. I'll handle the paperwork, Nate replied, sliding a notarized letter across her desk. I just need to see them. She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. All right, give me a few minutes. In the small archive room, the hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. Rows of folders stretched across metal shelves, decades of lives reduced to paper and ink. When Dr. Monroe returned, she carried a slim file marked Callahan, Margaret E. She placed it gently on the table. Here it is. Please be quick. Nate opened it, his fingers trembling slightly. The handwriting on the top sheet was unmistakably old, dated 15 years ago, but what caught his eye first was the time of death. It was listed twice, 2 different entries. The earlier one had been crossed out in darker ink. He frowned, flipping to the final page. The attending physician's signature looked wrong, shaky, uneven, almost as if it had been forged. "This isn't Dr. Lewis's handwriting," he murmured. Dr. Monroe's expression didn't change, but her voice lowered. "You knew him well enough to notice?" "He was our family doctor," Nate said. "He wrote every prescription I ever had." Quote. She glanced at the door, then back at him. "Some of the records from that year were revised. We had a computer migration, a few missing files. I've told the administration about it, but no one wanted to revisit old ghosts." "Do you have the original autopsy photos?" Nate asked. Her silence was answer enough. "They're missing too?" he pressed. "I'm sorry, Mr. Callahan. That's all I can give you." He closed the file carefully, but his mind raced. Missing documents, a falsified signature, 2 death times. This wasn't a clerical error. It was deliberate. Outside, the clouds began to break apart, spilling light through the glass doors. Nate stood in the lobby, gripping the rosary in his pocket. His mother's face flashed in his memory, laughing, humming a lullaby, calling him son. Victoria's voice buzzed from his phone before he could silence it. "Nathaniel, please tell me you're not digging around in that hospital." "I am," he said simply. Her tone hardened. "You're risking everything. Do you have any idea what this will do to the foundation?" "I'm not worried about the foundation," he said. "I'm worried about the truth." She exhaled sharply. "You can't live in the past forever." He ended the call without answering. For the first time, he realized she was right. He couldn't live in the past, but he could face it. The rain started again, soft and steady. He stepped outside, turning the collar of his coat against the drizzle. Somewhere deep in his pocket, the rosary clicked faintly, like a clock counting down to something inevitable. He didn't see the janitor until the man spoke from behind him. "Mr. Callahan?" Nate turned. The janitor was in his late 50s, with kind eyes and a mop still dripping water. "You don't remember me, do you? I worked here when your mama was admitted." Nate's heart thudded. "You knew her?" The man nodded. "I did, and I know she didn't die that night." For a moment, Nate couldn't find his voice. The janitor's words floated in the gray air like smoke. "She didn't die?" he finally asked. The man looked around, as if afraid of being overheard, and motioned toward a small maintenance corridor. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of bleach and rainwater dripping from the roof. "They moved her late that night," the janitor said. "I saw it myself. She was breathing. Weak, but breathing. They told me to mind my business." "Who told you?" Nate pressed, his pulse quickening. "The nurse in charge, Dr. Monroe, and a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't hospital staff, wore a dark suit, spoke to her like he owned the place." The janitor shook his head slowly. "I didn't understand then, but something about it wasn't right. I kept a copy of the security footage, just in case." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive wrapped in plastic. "Been holding on to this all these years. Don't know why. Guess I was waiting for somebody who cared enough to ask." Nate stared at it, barely able to breathe. "Why now?" The man's gaze softened. "Because sometimes the truth needs to find its way home. And maybe you're ready to hear it." Nate took the drive carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hand, lighter than guilt, heavier than memory. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Be careful," the man warned. "Some people don't want the dead to come back alive." Outside, the drizzle had thickened to steady rain. Nate walked back to his car, the flash drive hidden in his pocket. He sat behind the wheel, staring at it for a long moment before plugging it into his laptop. At first, the screen filled with static gray noise, faint lines, the grain of an old security feed. Then the picture steadied. The timestamp read the 16th of March, 2010, 11:47 p.m. The footage showed a hospital corridor, dimly lit, the camera tilted slightly to one side. 2 orderlies rolled a gurney down the hall. A woman lay on it, her face pale under a thin blanket. Even through the distortion, he recognized her. His mother. Nate leaned forward, heart pounding. The woman's chest rose faintly. She was breathing. A man in a dark suit walked beside her, saying something to Dr. Monroe, who followed close behind. The doctor glanced over her shoulder, nervous. The suited man handed her an envelope. She nodded once and looked away. Then the group vanished through a side door. The screen flickered again, cutting to black. Nate sat frozen. He played it again and again. Each time, the same truth pressed harder against him. She hadn't died. She'd been taken. The rain outside turned fierce, streaking across the windshield like tears. He thought of Eli, of the landfill, of the way the boy had said, "She hums when she works." He closed the laptop and pressed his palms over his face. For 15 years, he'd built his life on a lie, while the one person who had loved him without condition might still be somewhere waiting. The phone buzzed again, Victoria. He didn't want to answer, but he did. "Where are you?" she asked sharply. "At the hospital," he said. "I found something." "Whatever you think you found," she snapped. "Delete it. People in this town owe their fortunes to you, and to keeping certain stories buried." Nate's voice was calm now, colder than before. "I buried my mother once, Victoria. I won't do it again." He ended the call and started the engine. The tires splashed through puddles as he pulled away from the hospital, wipers beating in steady rhythm. He didn't have a plan, only direction toward Bayview, toward the truth. That night in his study, the city lights shimmered through the rain-streaked windows. He sat at his desk, the rosary beside the laptop, the flash drive still plugged in. The screen froze on the last image, his mother's face, blurred but alive. He reached out, tracing the outline of her features with his fingertips. "Mom," he whispered, voice breaking. "What did they do to you?" The room was silent, except for the hum of the computer and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then the cursor blinked, and a line of text appeared on the screen, a file name he hadn't noticed before. Transfer log, Bayview facility. His breath caught. He opened it. There, beneath a list of patient codes, one name stood clear. Callahan, Margaret E., relocated. Status, unknown. Nate sat back, his heartbeat loud in the quiet room. Rain hammered the glass like a warning. He stared at the words until they blurred. Somewhere out there, beyond the city, beyond all his excuses, his mother was waiting, and he would find her. The next morning dawned dull and heavy, clouds hanging low over Savannah, as if the sky itself were reluctant to wake. Nate drove alone through the industrial edge of town, past warehouses and rusted train yards where the scent of salt and oil mixed in the air. The map Eli had drawn sat on the passenger's seat, its pencil lines faint but sure. Bayview landfill wasn't on any tourist guide. The road leading there was narrow and broken, lined with dying oaks and stray dogs picking through trash. As Nate's sleek car rolled over the cracked pavement, the contrast between his world and this one struck him like a quiet shame. At the entrance, a hand-painted sign leaned sideways. "No trespassing. City property." He parked anyway. The air outside was thick with smoke and decay. Mountains of garbage loomed like dark hills under the gray sky. Seagulls circled overhead, crying out as if mocking him for what he'd come to find. "Mr. Callahan?" a voice called from behind. Nate turned to see Eli jogging up the hill, a backpack slung over his shoulder, his small face determined despite the smell and filth. "Didn't think you'd really come," the boy said, breathing hard. "I gave my word," Nate replied. "Lead the way." Eli grinned faintly and started climbing one of the dirt paths that cut through the heaps. "Careful where you step. Some of it's soft." They moved through the wasteland in silence. The only sounds the crunch of glass and the hum of distant trucks. At the top of a ridge, the view opened wide. Miles of discarded things. Metal, tires, broken toys, old furniture. Among it all, people moved like ghosts, searching for scraps. Eli pointed to a cluster of shacks made from wood and tin, smoke curling from one of them. "That's where she used to stay, before they took her to the hospice." Nate's heart lurched. "You mean San Gabriel?" The boy nodded. "Old Mr. Jenkins told me." They descended carefully, and soon a man emerged from one of the shacks, tall and lean, his white beard catching the wind. He wore an old brown coat and a cap tilted low. "Morning, Eli," he greeted, then looked curiously at Nate. "You brought company." "Mr. Jenkins," Eli said proudly. "This is the man I told you about, the one whose mama was here." The old man's eyes softened. "Well now, I thought the boy was spinning tales." "Guess I owe him an apology." He extended a hand. "Name's Harold Jenkins. Used to teach English before the school shut down. What brings a man like you to a place like this?" Nate shook his hand firmly. "The truth," he said simply. Jenkins studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the nearest shack. "Come on then, I'll show you something." Inside, the air was musty but orderly. A makeshift bed, a few books stacked neatly, and on one wall a piece of scrap wood carved with faint letters. N.C. Mom loves you. Nate reached out to touch it, his throat tightening. The letters were uneven, shaky, but unmistakable. His vision blurred as he whispered, "She really was here." Jenkins spoke softly behind him. "A woman came a few years back, fragile but polite. Played melodies on anything that'd make a sound, bottles, cans, bits of pipe. Said her boy used to play piano for her. Said he'd forgotten the tune but not the heart." Eli watched quietly, his hands tucked in his pockets. "I told you she wasn't gone," he murmured. Nate turned to him, voice unsteady. "You were right, Eli. You were right about everything." He looked around the shack again. On a broken shelf sat a tin cup holding a few rosary beads, strung on fishing line, missing the same bead as the one he carried. He picked it up reverently, feeling the connection bridge years of distance and disbelief. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Mr. Jenkins leaned against the doorway. "You know," he said, "some folks end up here because they lost everything. Others because they were thrown away. But your mama, she was neither. She was waiting." Nate turned toward the old man. "Waiting for what?" "For you, son," Jenkins said simply. "She told me once, when my boy finds his way back to light, he'll find me too." The words settled into Nate's heart like rain into dry earth. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the piles of rusted metal, whispering faint music through hollow cans. The wind grew stronger, bending the tin walls of the shack until they creaked like a groaning ship. Nate stood there in silence, the rosary trembling in his hand. The faint engraving N.C. Mom loves you burned into his sight. For 15 years, he'd buried every trace of his mother's memory beneath ambition and guilt. But here, in this forsaken place, her presence felt alive again, fragile but real. He sank to his knees before the carving, his palm resting over the letters. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice breaking. "I should have looked for you. I should have listened." Eli knelt beside him, his small hand resting lightly on Nate's arm. "She never blamed you, sir," he said softly. "She said love always finds the way back." Nate closed his eyes, letting the words settle like prayer. The smell of rust and smoke filled his lungs, but for the first time, he didn't mind. He could almost hear her, the faint hum of an old lullaby, carried on the wind that swept through the shantytown. Mr. Jenkins moved closer, his voice low and gentle. "She used to sit outside at sundown and play music with the kids here. Said it made her forget the pain. One night, a white van came. Said it was from a hospice upstate, taking her somewhere clean and quiet. She didn't want to go, but they said she had no choice." "A hospice," Nate murmured. "Do you remember the name?" Jenkins scratched his beard. "Something with Gabriel in it, I think. Sounded holy." "San Gabriel," Nate said under his breath. The same name that had appeared in the files. His stomach twisted. Just then, Eli stepped out of the shack, pointing toward the ridge. "Mr. Nate, look!" Nate followed his gaze. In the distance, through the mist of rain and smoke, a van was winding down the dirt road, white, boxy, with faded blue lettering barely visible on the side. St. Gabriel Care Services. "That's them," Eli said, his voice rising. "That's the same kind that came for her." Without thinking, Nate started running. His shoes slipped on the mud, splashing through puddles of chemical water, his breath clouding the cold air. "Wait!" he shouted, waving his arms. The van didn't stop, its tires chewed through the gravel, engine roaring as it turned toward the highway. Nate reached the top of the hill, chest heaving, just in time to see the vehicle vanish beyond the bend. The rain came harder now, drumming on metal and glass like the echo of his own heart. He dropped to one knee, gripping the mud-soaked rosary. "She's alive," he whispered, half in disbelief, half in promise. "Mom, I'm coming." Eli caught up to him, panting, his face pale and wet. "They go north," he said quickly. "Mr. Jenkins says the hospice is in Macon, past the river road." Nate turned to him, eyes fierce with a new kind of resolve. "Then that's where we're going." "You mean now?" Eli asked, startled. "Now," Nate said, standing up, his coat plastered to his shoulders. "I've wasted enough time." They hurried back toward the car. Jenkins called after them. "Be careful out there, son. That road's got long shadows." Nate raised a hand in thanks without looking back. He opened the passenger door for Eli. "Buckle up," he said. The boy slid into the seat, still catching his breath. "Do you think she'll remember you?" Nate paused before starting the engine. The question struck deeper than he expected. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But I remember her. That's enough for now." The car roared to life, headlights slicing through the storm. As they pulled away, the landfill shrank behind them, a mountain of forgotten things glowing faintly under the lightning. Inside the car, silence fell, broken only by the wiper's steady rhythm. Nate drove with both hands tight on the wheel, the rosary swinging from the rearview mirror, glinting with each flash of lightning like a compass guiding him through the dark. Eli glanced at him, hesitant. "You really think that place is safe?" "No," Nate said, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But I think that's where the truth lives now." Outside, thunder cracked long and low as the white lines on the highway stretched into the unknown. The storm followed them, but for the first time, Nate didn't feel afraid. Somewhere beyond the rain, a mother waited, and a reckoning approached. As the car disappeared into the fog, a second vehicle, black, unmarked, pulled out from behind the landfill gates, headlights off, following at a careful distance. The rain had thinned to a mist by the time Nate and Eli hit the highway. The sky above Georgia stretched wide and silver, heavy with the promise of another storm. The road ahead wound north toward Macon and toward San Gabriel Hospice. The wipers swept in slow rhythm, a metronome counting the seconds between memory and revelation. Eli sat quietly in the passenger seat, his knees pulled close, watching the raindrops slide down the window. "Do you think they're taking her there now?" he asked softly. Nate's eyes stayed fixed on the road. "If they are, we'll find her before they move her again." The words came out steady, but his pulse strummed hard. Every few miles, he checked the rearview mirror. A black SUV trailed them, keeping its distance headlights dimmed, too careful to be random traffic. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia. Then it took every turn he did. He flicked his blinker, shifted lanes suddenly, then slowed near an old diner off the highway. The SUV slowed too, his stomach clenched. "Eli," he said, pulling off the road, "we're stopping for a bit." The diner was the kind of place that hadn't changed since the 70s, neon sign buzzing, smell of bacon grease thick in the air. A waitress with a tired smile led them to a booth by the window. "Coffee?" she asked. "Strong," Nate said. "And a chocolate milk for the kid." Ellie smiled shyly. "Thank you, Mom." The waitress poured the coffee, the sound hissing over the chatter of truckers and the clink of cutlery. Outside, the black SUV idled across the street. Nate's reflection trembled in the window glass as he leaned closer to Eli. "Listen," he said quietly. "If anything happens, you stay here. Find someone and call the police." Eli frowned. "Are they bad people?" "Not to hesitate it. They're afraid of the truth. And fear makes people dangerous." He took a sip of coffee, eyes flicking to the window again. The SUV's engine cut off. Two silhouettes sat motionless inside. A man in a baseball cap entered the diner, scanning the room casually before heading toward the counter. Nate's instinct screamed. He reached for his wallet, leaving bills on the table. "Come on," he murmured to Eli. "We're leaving through the kitchen." "Oh." They slipped past the waitress with a quick nod and pushed through the swinging door. The kitchen smelled of onions and steam. A back exit led into an alley where rainwater trickled between dumpsters. The boy's small hand clutched his coat sleeve. "Why are they following us?" Eli whispered. "Because they know where we're going," Nate said. "And they don't want us to get there first." He led Eli to a side street, crouching behind a delivery truck until the SUV rolled past the diner. Once it disappeared down the road, he exhaled shakily. "Come on. There's an old service route that runs parallel to the main highway. It'll buy us some time." They got back in the car, merging onto a narrow two-lane road lined with pines. For a while, only the sound of tires on wet asphalt filled the silence. "Mr. Nate," Eli said after a while, "were you scared when your mom got sick?" The question pierced deeper than the boy could have known. Nate swallowed. "I was angry," he admitted. "I thought working harder would make the pain smaller." "It didn't." Eli nodded slowly. "That's how I felt when my dad left. I tried to pretend I didn't care, but pretending doesn't fix anything, does it?" Nate smiled faintly. "No, son, it doesn't." The word son hung in the air between them, natural, unforced, and it filled the car with quiet warmth, even as thunder growled beyond the tree line. Up ahead, A detour sign glowed in the mist. Road closed. Local traffic only. Nate turned the wheel, following a gravel path through an abandoned industrial park. For a while, everything seemed still. Then, headlights bloomed in the rearview mirror, the same black SUV, emerging from the fog like a phantom. Eli gasped. "It's them again! Hold on!" Nate pressed the accelerator. Gravel spat from the tires as they tore down the narrow road. The SUV followed, its engine snarling, headlights flashing once a warning, not an attack. Nate veered left into a stretch of dirt leading toward a derelict gas station. The car jolted hard over potholes. The SUV slowed, but didn't stop. Instead, it idled at a distance, lights off again. Watching, Nate got out, stepping into the rain. Coat soaked instantly. "What do you want?" he shouted into the dark. No answer, just the steady hiss of rainfall and the faint hum of the SUV's engine. Then, with a low growl, it reversed and disappeared into the night. He stood there breathing hard, pulse thundering in his ears. Whoever they weren't finished. But they were afraid to strike. Not yet. Back inside the car, Eli's eyes were wide. "Mr. Nate, why don't you just call the police?" "Because," Nate said quietly, starting the engine, "when money's involved, not everyone in uniform tells the truth." The road ahead glistened under the rain like a river of silver. He glanced at the map spread across the dashboard, tracing the final stretch toward Macon. "Another hour," he murmured. "That's all we need." Eli leaned against the seat, whispering as if to himself, "She's gonna be so happy to see you." Nate's throat tightened. "I hope you're right, kid." Outside, lightning flashed, and for an instant, it illuminated a sign half hidden behind vines. San Gabriel Refuge, 5 miles ahead. He gripped the wheel, breath-catching. "We're close." Ice grating. The storm rolled above them, low and restless. The black SUV appeared again in the far distance, creeping back onto the road like a shadow refusing to die. Nate didn't slow this time. He pressed harder on the gas, eyes locked on the faint outline of the Hospice road ahead. The next flash of lightning revealed something that froze his heart. A white van parked sideways across the road, blocking the entrance to San Gabriel. Its rear doors stood open, swaying in the storm, and on the ground beneath them, a familiar scarf, blue and rain-soaked, fluttering against the asphalt. The storm came down like a living thing, hissing through the trees as Nate's car rolled to a stop. The headlight struck a white van parked sideways across the narrow road, its hazard lights blinking slow and steady through the rain. "Stay in the car," Nate said, already opening the door. "Mr. Nate," Eli began, but Nate's tone left no room for argument. "Lock it." The rain hit him like needles. The van's back doors hung open, swinging in the wind. Inside lay an abandoned stretcher, straps undone. A small blue scarf clung to the mud, his mother's, embroidered with lilac flowers. He picked it up, heart pounding. It was still warm. Inside, the flickering light revealed a few words scrawled in red marker. "Help. Her room 9. Then came the growl of an engine. A black SUV pulled up behind him, headlights glaring. 2 men stepped out, coats glistening. "Mr. Callahan," one called. "Step away from the vehicle." "Who are you?" Nate shouted over the storm. "Security," the man replied. "You're trespassing on property owned by San Gabriel Hospice and long-term care." "No." Nate's breath caught. "You mean the hospice where my mother was taken?" "You need to go home," the man said coldly. "You don't understand the kind of people involved." Nate took a step closer. "You're right. I don't understand why you're lying to me." Before the man could answer, Eli's small voice rang from the car. "Leave him alone." The guards turned and Nate moved. He lunged, knocking the transmitter from the man's hand. "Run," he yelled. Eli bolted toward the woods. Nate followed, slipping on mud, the roar of the SUV behind them. Branches whipped their faces as they crashed through the trees. When they finally stopped, both were gasping for breath. Eli clutched his arm. "Why do they want her?" Nate leaned against a tree. "Because if she's alive, it means someone paid to fake her death, and that truth costs millions." He looked up through the rain, heart hammering. Through the trees, he saw faint lights in the valley, a low stone building glowing in the mist. "San Gabriel Hospice," he whispered. "Are we going?" Eli asked. "Yes," Nate said quietly. "Right now." They reached the fence of the hospice within the hour. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, fog curling around the lights. Nate pried open a gap in the chain link and motioned for Eli to crawl through first. The building loomed gray and silent, its windows flickering weakly. "Stay close," he whispered. Inside, the hallway smelled of antiseptic and old flowers. His shoes left wet prints on the linoleum. He moved past the numbered doors, 6, 7, 8, until he saw it. Room 9. He pushed the door open. A lamp glowed beside the bed, and on it lay Margaret Callahan, pale, thin, breathing shallowly. Tubes traced down her arms. A rosary rested on her lap, missing one bead. "Mom," he breathed. Her eyes fluttered open. For a long moment, confusion clouded them. Then they filled with tears. "Nathaniel?" He fell to his knees beside her. "It's me, Mom. I found you." She touched his face, voice trembling. "They told me you were safe. That was the only reason I stayed quiet." "What did they do to you?" Her words came slow, heavy. "They kept me sedated. For months at a time. Said I'd be released when the company was safe again." The door creaked. Dr. Monroe stepped inside, her expression drawn with guilt. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "You faked her death," Nate said. Monroe's eyes shone with shame. "I did what I was told, but I can't carry it anymore. They moved her here 2 weeks ago, after an investor started asking questions. If you want her to live, take her now." She handed him a small folder. Proof. Medical records, payment logs, everything. Outside, Eli shouted, "Mr. Nate, someone's coming!" Nate wrapped his mother in a blanket and lifted her gently. She was light, trembling, but alive. Monroe opened the rear exit. "Go." Rain hit his face as they ran to the car. Flashlights flared behind them. He set her in the back seat, Eli clutching her hand. As they sped down the road, Margaret whispered weakly, "Promise me, Nathaniel. Don't let anger guide you." "I promise," he said, gripping the wheel. In the rearview mirror, San Gabriel Hospice and long-term care disappeared into darkness, a prison left behind. The rain had stopped before sunrise, leaving the world washed clean. The highway shimmered in the early light, silver and endless, stretching north like a promise. Nate's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was a storm. In the back seat, Margaret slept under a wool blanket, her breath even and calm for the first time in years. The sedatives were wearing off slowly. Sometimes, she murmured, caught in fragments of dreams. Once she said his name, Nathaniel, and he had to look away, afraid the sound would undo him. Eli sat beside her, awake but quiet, watching the clouds roll by. "Is she going to be okay?" he whispered. Nate glanced in the mirror. "She will. She just needs time." He didn't add that time was something they didn't have. In his jacket pocket lay the small folder Dr. Monroe had given him: records, ledgers, a USB drive labeled Street Augustine accounts. He'd looked at them briefly during a fuel stop. The files linked his father's old corporation to false charities, offshore accounts, and hush money paid to hospice directors, including the one at San Gabriel Hospice and long-term care. The truth was explosive, but it was also dangerous. It could destroy reputations, end careers, and maybe end lives. They drove for hours without stopping. Somewhere past Macon, Nate finally spoke. "Eli, remember what I said about courage?" The boy nodded. "Yeah, you said it's doing the right thing, even when you're scared." "Good. Keep remembering that." He reached for the rosary hanging from the rearview mirror, the one missing a bead. The chain swayed gently with the rhythm of the road. Then his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he knew the voice the instant it spoke. Nathaniel. Victoria. Her voice was thinner than he remembered, but her control hadn't changed. "You have to listen to me. You don't understand what you're holding." "I understand perfectly," he said. "You helped build it." "I didn't fake her death," she said quickly, almost desperate. "But I helped cover it up. I thought it would protect the company. And you." "Protect me?" His voice cracked like dry wood. "You kept me from my mother for 15 years. A pause. "If this goes public, they'll come for all of us. The investors, the board, the families who took the bribes. You'll be hunted like they're hunting me." "Maybe it's time someone hunted the right people," Nate said. She drew in a shaky breath. "Nathaniel, they already know where you are." The line went dead. Nate dropped the phone, eyes narrowing. "Hold on." He pressed the gas, the car surging forward. A mile later, Headlights appeared in the mirror dark, unmarked, moving fast. "Mr. Nate?" Ellie said, voice trembling. "Sie Atbelt. Now, ins." The SUV closed the distance. The driver's window rolled down. A man leaned out, motioning for him to pull over. Nate's jaw tightened. Not today. He turned off the main road, tires screaming against the wet asphalt. They sped through back roads lined with oak trees, Spanish moss whipping in the wind. Margaret stirred, whispering, "Nathaniel, what's happening?" "Just hang on, Mom." The SUV followed, relentless. Finally, at a crossroads, Nate killed the headlights and veered into a dirt path toward an old barn half hidden by trees. The SUV roared past, unaware. They waited in silence until the sound of engines faded. Only then did Nate breathe again. His hands shook on the wheel. Eli reached forward, small and steady. "You didn't let them win." Nate looked at him and felt something shift, not pride, but purpose. "No," he said softly. "Not this time." I foresaw him. He stepped out of the car, looked at the fading tire tracks, and knew the clock was ticking. The truth had a price, and they were about to pay it. They reached Atlanta by mid-afternoon. The city shimmered under a pale sun, alive with noise and traffic. To Nate, it looked both familiar and foreign, a place he'd once ruled from glass towers. Now nothing but a field of ghosts. He parked behind a narrow brick building downtown. A faded sign over the door read, "The Savannah Observer, independent journalism since 1964. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, paper, and ink. "Paul Ritter," Nate called. A man in his 60s appeared, sleeves rolled up, glasses hanging from his neck. When he saw Nate, his brows furrowed in disbelief and then widened at the sight of Margaret, fragile but standing beside her son. "Good Lord," Paul whispered. "Margaret Callahan?" She smiled faintly. "Still breathing?" Paul stared between them. "I thought—" "So did I," Nate said. "She was hidden at San Gabriel Hospice. We have proof." He placed the USB and folder on the desk. Paul's fingers hovered over them like they were holy relics. This is huge. You sure you want me to publish this? You'll be burning every bridge left." "I already burned them," Nate said quietly. "Now I'm just lighting what's true." Paul hesitated. "You realize who'll come after you? The same people who silenced her? That's why I came to you," Nate said. "You're not afraid of ghosts." Paul smiled grimly. "Not since my first divorce." He gestured toward the back room. "Let's get this story straight." They spent hours cross-checking files. Margaret gave a statement in her trembling handwriting. Eli fell asleep on a couch with an old newspaper as a blanket. As night settled, Paul printed the first draft. He handed it to Nate. The headline read, "Margaret Callahan, the woman who wouldn't stay dead." Nate exhaled. "You've still got a flair for drama," Paul chuckled. "It sells papers." Then he sobered. "You're sure she's safe now?" Nate looked toward his mother, asleep under a lamp's warm glow. "She's safe because the truth finally has her name on it." They walked out into the cool night air. Streetlights hummed. The rain from earlier had left puddles that mirrored the city lights like fragments of fire. Margaret took his arm. "You've done it, my boy. But promise me, let this be the end, not the start of another war." "I promise," he said softly. A sudden glint caught his eye, a small red dot sweeping briefly across the wet pavement. He didn't speak, just tightened his grip on her hand. "Get in the car," he said quietly. She obeyed without question. Eli climbed in the back, rubbing his eyes. Down the block, a black SUV rolled to a stop. The same model as before. For a long moment, both vehicles faced each other, the hum of their engines filling the silence. Then, slowly, the SUV backed away into the dark. Nate waited until it disappeared before speaking. "They're not gone," he said. "They're waiting to see what I'll do." Margaret looked at him. "And what will you do, Nathaniel?" He turned toward the horizon, where the city lights shimmered like distant candles. "Tomorrow, the truth gets its turn. After that, maybe we get ours." She smiled faintly. "Then let's go home." He started the engine. The radio came alive with a soft jazz tune, one of his mother's favorites. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like running. As they drove south through the sleeping city, Margaret whispered, "You were a boy when I left, and now you're the man I prayed you'd become." He looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. "You gave me the reason to change." The skyline faded behind them. Ahead, the road curved toward the coast, toward Savannah, toward the house with the porch and the piano waiting. And as the first stars broke through the clouds, Nate realized that the price of truth was high, but the cost of silence had been far greater. He gripped the wheel, steady now, and drove toward the light. The dawn came softly to Savannah, brushing the rooftops with gold. For the first time in years, the Callahan house breathed again. Curtains fluttered in the morning breeze, and the faint smell of rain lingered over the porch. Nate stood by the window, watching the neighborhood stir awake, a mailman on his route, a woman walking her dog, the sound of church bells in the distance. Everything felt ordinary, and that was exactly what he had prayed for. Behind him, the old grandfather clock ticked. Margaret stirred on the couch, her blanket slipping to the floor. She blinked slowly, eyes adjusting to the light. "Morning, Mom," Nate said, kneeling beside her. For a second, she didn't answer. She just looked at him, as if trying to memorize the lines of his face. Then she smiled. "You have your father's eyes, but softer." He chuckled. "Guess life sanded down the edges." "Sometimes pain does that," she said gently, her hand finding his. "Sometimes it makes room for light." In the kitchen, Eli was clattering dishes, far too many for someone his size. Nate called out, "Easy, buddy. Those plates are older than me." Eli grinned from the doorway, holding a tray like a proud waiter. "Breakfast is ready." He'd made scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee so strong it could wake the dead. Margaret laughed when she saw it. "Look at you, a little chef." "I learned from YouTube," Eli said seriously, setting the table. They ate together, sunlight spilling across the table. For a few moments, it was just laughter and quiet chewing. No deadlines, no headlines, no ghosts. After breakfast, Nate walked his mother through the garden behind the house. The grass was damp, glistening. The roses she had planted 15 years ago were wild now, blooming in thick clusters. "I thought they'd die without me," she whispered. "They didn't," he said. "They waited." Margaret stopped by the lilac bush, touching the petals. "So did you." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. Years of guilt, forgiveness, love, and the quiet relief of finally being seen. When they went back inside, Eli sat at the piano, his legs barely reaching the pedals. "Play with me?" he asked. Nate hesitated. "I haven't played in years." "Then start now," Margaret said from the armchair, smiling faintly. "The keys remember more than you think." Nate sat down beside Eli. His fingers trembled as they hovered above the keys. Then one note, then another. The melody came back slowly, like a heartbeat returning. It was the lullaby Margaret used to hum at night, back when he was small enough to fall asleep on her lap. Margaret's voice joined them, soft but pure. The sound filled the house, spilling into the yard. Even the birds outside seemed to pause. Eli looked at Nate halfway through and whispered, "She sings like an angel." Nate smiled through tears. She always did. When the song ended, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. Margaret leaned back, eyes closed, whispering, "That's what I prayed for, to hear that again." The world outside was still noisy reporters, headlines, justice being served, but in this small kitchen, time stopped. Nate reached across the piano and took her hand. "We're home now," he said. By late afternoon, the city had erupted. Paul Ritter's newspaper had gone viral. The story of Margaret Callahan's survival and the corporate fraud behind her disappearance had become national news. Stock tickers froze, lawyers scrambled, and the Callahan name, once synonymous with power, was now a symbol of accountability. But inside the White House on Juniper Street, there was peace. Margaret napped on the porch swing, a thin shawl around her shoulders. The rosary, her rebuilt one, dangled loosely from her hand. Each bead caught the sun like a small star. Nate sat nearby, sipping coffee. Eli was sprawled on the steps with a notebook, drawing stick figures of the three of them under a huge Sunday. "You gave me hair this time," Nate said, smiling. Eli grinned. "You earned it. Heroes need hair." Nate laughed softly, shaking his head. "I'm no hero, kid. Just someone who got lost and found his way back." The boy looked up. "That's what heroes do." Ensign quote. They sat quietly for a while, listening to the rustle of magnolia leaves. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's radio played an old Willie Nelson tune. After a while, Margaret woke and looked around, blinking at the sunset. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" "It is," Nate said. "Your father used to say sunsets are God's way of forgiving the day," she murmured. "No matter how dark it's been." He turned toward her. "Do you forgive me, Mom? For not looking sooner? For believing them?" Her smile was tired but full of grace. "Nathaniel, forgiveness isn't a door you open once. It's a road you walk every day." Eli looked between them, sensing something sacred. "Then we walk it together," he said simply. The air grew cooler as evening deepened. Fireflies began to blink along the fence. Nate lit the porch light, not too bright, just enough to keep the shadows soft. Margaret's voice broke the quiet. "Do you know why I kept that rosary even when they took everything else?" He shook his head. "Because I believed one day one of us would finish it," she said, holding up the chain. The last bead was missing, the wire frayed where it should have been complete. Nate reached into his pocket and pulled out the old rosary, the one he'd carried since the landfill, missing the same bead. Without speaking, he tied them together. The two rosaries formed a circle, whole again. Tears slipped down Margaret's face. "Now it's complete." Nate kissed her forehead. "So are we." From the open window, the piano began to play again. Eli's small hands trying to remember the melody from that morning. The notes stumbled but carried warmth, like a child learning to speak love. Margaret leaned back, whispering, "That's what hope sounds like." Nate sat beside her, watching the twilight settle. The porch creaked. The air smelled of lilacs and coffee. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you ever think Dad would have wanted this ending?" She smiled, eyes distant. "I think he would have wanted peace. And you found it." He nodded, his throat tight. "For all of us." Inside, the clock struck 8, the same hour it had stopped 15 years ago. On the night, everything fell apart. The pendulum swung once, twice, and then started ticking again. Nate laughed softly. "Guess even time decided to forgive us." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You gave it a reason." The wind picked up, carrying laughter from inside where Eli had discovered how to make the piano sound like a trumpet. Nate leaned back, looking at the stars appearing one by one. "You know, for years I thought redemption was about fixing what's broken. Turns out, it's about learning to live with the cracks and letting light through them." His mother smiled. "That's what grace looks like." He turned off the porch light, letting the moon take over. The house glowed faintly, warm and alive. Inside, the two rosaries hung by the piano, intertwined the missing beads facing each other like tiny mirrors. The music carried through the open window, soft and clumsy and utterly perfect. And for the first time in 15 years, the Callahan home was filled with sound, laughter, and peace. The kind of peace that doesn't erase the past, but transforms it. Sometimes, the greatest journeys end not with applause, but with quiet mornings, a pot of coffee on the porch, a song half remembered, and the sound of laughter finally returning home. Nate and Margaret didn't win fame or fortune. They found something far rarer, peace after pain, forgiveness after years of silence, and the warmth of a family rebuilt from the ashes of truth. In a world that often worships success, their story reminds us that love and redemption are the real treasures. Kindness, the kind that expects nothing in return, can change the course of a life. Like a porch light left burning through the night, a single act of compassion can guide even the weary back home. So tonight, take a moment to think of your own story, the people you've lost, the ones you've forgiven, and those who've helped you heal. If this story touched your heart, type 1 inch the comments. If you think it could be better, type 0 your voice matters here. And if this tale brought you a little peace, I hope you'll stay with us and share it with someone who could use a light in their dark,